All right, well, fall is upon us, and we're outside doing the fire pit, eating some s'mores, enjoying the cooler weather, and we are moving into the Major League Baseball playoff season, which is exciting. So I thought it's been a little while since I've done a fireside chat with Brad. I guess I did a couple inside ones, but not some outside by the fireplace. And one of my recent wormholes of research has actually been not only baseball history, but specifically the history of the Negro Leagues, which is a fascinating history, and some really interesting stories and a lot of interesting players. But the person I actually want to kind of highlight and focus on is a player that the vast majority of people know, even the casual fan or even non-baseball fan, because his story's been told and told again, and it's been even a major motion picture. But what they might not know is some of the backstory, okay? And that's actually Jackie Robinson. Now, the common sort of narrative, the Hollywood narrative around Jackie Robinson is that, he was this, phenomenal talent that was so good, he was too good to be left out of the major leagues. This guy, Branch Rickey, decided he was going to break the color barrier and bring Robinson in to play for the Dodgers, and therefore sort of break this rule around segregation. And that Robinson comes in, he's this dominant figure, this dominant player, goes on to have a Hall of Fame career, and becomes the first black player to play in Major League Baseball. As it turns out, all of that is sort of true, but like with any history, it's far more complex. And actually, this is where the history of the Negro Leagues is helpful. So as it turns out, baseball was actually integrated from the start. It was not a segregated sport. And there were actually many black players who played alongside white players, even in the 1800s, okay? So this happened. And there were, professional teams that existed, and they toured around the country and played each other. But as you get into like the late 1800s, 1890s, moving into the 1900s, the issue of segregation became more pressing. Some of that was just because of owners. Some of it was because of the commissioner of baseball, specifically a man by the name of Kennesaw Mountain Landis. And some of it was just society as a whole started to create rules around segregation. And this also made things like travel inevitably more difficult, and all kinds of other variables. So as a result of this, what ended up happening is this ruling about segregating the sport. Now again, what a lot of people don't know or realize is that this was not an official law in the books. There was no written or formal law that said that the African American players couldn't play alongside the Caucasian players. It instead was actually just a gentleman's agreement that was largely being enforced by the then commissioner of baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis. This agreement was basically between him and the owners, and they just decided that for their own choices, they would keep the league segregated. One second. Okay, so yeah, one of the common misconceptions is that it was a formal law, and it wasn't. It was a gentleman's agreement. Another common misconception is that it was this guy, Branch Rickey, who ended up bringing Robinson in, who was sort of the guy who was a sort of forward thinker, who sort of challenged the norms and was this sort of revolutionary socially by bringing Robinson into the league. But the reality is that there were a lot of players, managers, coaches, and even some owners who had already tried to integrate baseball long before Branch Rickey and long before Jackie Robinson. They were just continually met with frustrations because of Kennesaw Mountain Landis' power over the league. He was kind of this domineering presence. One example that I can give you is a guy by the name of Bill Veeck, who was actually looking to buy the Philadelphia Phillies at the time. And his whole plan was to buy the Phillies and then to bring in a bunch of the superstar players from the Negro Leagues and stack his team in Major League Baseball to take them to the pennant race. Because he knew that there was this talent in the other league, the Negro League, that was just sitting there waiting to be used. And if he brought them in the league, he was pretty much certain he could win a pennant. Well, when Landis found out about this and got word of this, he actually forced the owner of the Phillies to sell it to a lower bidder so that Veeck couldn't get into the league. And this, again, happened long before Branch Rickey ever tried to bring Robinson to the league. Veeck ended up going on and buying the Cleveland Indians, and actually ended up being the guy who brought an older Satchel Paige into the league several years again after Robinson had already reintegrated the league. Okay, so that's another misconception. There were already people trying to do this. They were just blocked. Okay, so the third misconception is to think that Jackie Robinson was this superstar in the Negro Leagues. Okay, okay, that was dominating the Negro Leagues, and that's why they brought him in. So let's stop there and get into a little bit of the Negro League history, because it's going to be valuable to explain all of this information. Okay, so first and foremost, the Negro Leagues had been around for a long time. They had a lot of superstar players that had already made a name for themselves. What many people don't know is that these leagues, these teams, actually would play some of the white teams, and even sometimes they would integrate. They just wouldn't do it during the Major League Baseball season or with officially sanctioned Major League teams. Back then, baseball players didn't make a lot of money. They had various contract disputes, which basically tied them to an organization for life unless the organization traded them off. This is in Major League Baseball, by the way, not in Negro Leagues. The Negro Leagues actually had a system much more closer to our free agency. They could go wherever they wanted, which is why if you look at all the top-tier Negro League players, they typically moved around a lot and played for whatever team offered them the most money. This allowed them actually to make more money. In the case of someone like Satchel Paige, he made probably, in all likelihood, more money than the superstars in the Major League Baseball, the white leagues. But anyways, I digress. So, as a result of this, a lot of the Major League players, these would be the white players, during the off-season would do barnstorming tours, which would they do these unsanctioned games where they'd travel around the country, and they'd play other teams, and oftentimes they would play the Negro League teams. And this was a time that it allowed these players in the Negro League to go against the players in the Major Leagues. And they would assemble these all-star teams, and they'd play each other. And according to statistics, more often than not, the Negro League teams would beat these Major League all-star teams. So every bit is competent and every bit is capable of playing, and everyone knew that these players were excellent and that they were more than capable of competing at a Major League level, because during these barnstorming tours, they would compete against them. And similar things would happen in the Latin American leagues where they play there as well. So players knew it, coaches knew it, even some of the owners knew it. But the barrier was Landis. So why is it that Branch Rickey brings in Jackie Robinson when he does? Well, here's the story. First and foremost, what you have to understand is that Kennesaw Mountain Landis dies. Okay, and once he dies, they bring in another commissioner of baseball, and at that point in time, that's when Branch Rickey sees the opportunity. He's an opportunist, and he's like, now's the time to integrate, because we have a new Major League Baseball commissioner, and that sort of unwritten rule, although still there, was only really being enforced by Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Well, why Jackie Robinson? And this is the more interesting story. Everyone else pretty much thought that the first players that would be integrated into Major League Baseball would be one of a handful of players. First, there was Satchel Paige, who was arguably the greatest pitcher of all time, but certainly the greatest of his era. People thought he was going to be the first. But then there were also several great hitters. Paige was a pitcher, by the way. I think I said that already. But you had guys like Buck Leonard. You had Cool Papa Bell. You had, Charles, Oscar Charleston, and there's a bunch. There's a ton of these really, really talented guys that are now thankfully in the Hall of Fame, and they've been since honored. But Jackie Robinson was a wild card. And what people don't often know, maybe they do, is that Robinson was not known as being a proficient baseball player. Robinson had become a celebrity athlete because he was a college football star. And the thing about that era is that college sports were substantially more popular than professional sports. Yet, if you were going to be a professional athlete, really the only sport that you had an opportunity to play and make a substantial livable wage was professional baseball, because baseball was the most popular sport overall, but certainly the most popular professional sport. But Jackie Robinson went to UCLA, which was a very, it still is a big college. It was a very popular college, and it was a college that was integrated, and they actually brought in a handful of black players to compete. I think Robinson was like 1 or 5 or 6 players on his team, and he ended up being a superstar running back there. They ended up being a dominant football team, and Robinson had a kind of an audience or following across the country, not only in the black communities, but also in the white communities. So he was a household name. He was also a track star. He was a world-class track star, track runner, and also a very talented basketball player. Turns out Robinson actually wasn't a very good baseball player, at least initially. He played 1 season at UCLA, and he batted a miserable 97. That's right. So it was odd that Robinson decided to be a pro baseball player at all. In fact, he went off to the war. You probably know that story. Came back to the States, was doing some coaching, and actually it was the Kansas City Monarchs, I believe was the team, a Negro League team, who offered him a contract to come play baseball for them based off his reputation as an athlete and sort of his fame as being this sort of superstar football player, basketball player, track runner. So when Branch Rickey picked Robinson to be the guy to integrate, that was a shocker because he wasn't by any stretch the best player out there. But what they realized is that Robinson met a criteria of what Rickey was looking for. For starters, he was college educated, okay? He was also a guy who had played on integrated teams before. He was a younger guy, which means he would be coming up into the leagues and starting out. And he had a certain disposition that Branch Rickey felt would be better than some of the other players. Essentially, he was palatable. He was palatable to white audiences, whereas some of these other players were not. All the players in the Negro League were already working for a different player to get placed, which is a guy by the name of Monty Irving. Now, Irving would end up being placed in the major leagues 2 years after Robinson, and he went on to have a Hall of Fame career, and he is in the Hall of Fame now. But he's a name that a baseball aficionado knows, but probably the casual fan may not have even heard of. Certainly not to the level of Jackie Robinson. But probably the most troubling thing about Jackie Robinson, or polarizing, and of course every person, every story, there's always caveats and interesting things in history. But once all these Negro League stars, guys like Cool Papa Bell, etc., learned that Rickey wanted Robinson, their primary goal was just to get the leagues integrated, because they knew once someone broke the color barrier, then more players would get to go. So to them it was like, all right, well, it's kind of irrelevant who the person is, let's just get someone in the door. Robinson, again, was not their pick. In fact, he'd been riding the bench in Kansas City. He wasn't even a primary player. So these guys essentially worked with Robinson beforehand and off season to really get him to develop his skills better. He was wanting to be a shortstop, and he was not a really gifted fielder, at least not at this point in time in his career. And they basically told him, you're not good enough to play shortstop. So they made him change out of that position. He went on to play first base and second base, etc. And he had a lot of holes in his hitting. He had power, but he didn't know how to move the ball around the field. So these guys worked with him, basically taught him skills. And to his credit, he did go on to have a great career. But even Cool Papa Bell goes on the record stating that he was shocked, along with many of the other Negro League players, that Robinson ended up being as good as he was. Because when he first came into the league, he was, minimally talented. I mean, he showed promise. There's no question, and everyone knew he was a superstar athlete. I'm not going to say he wasn't good. He wasn't the best player in the league by any stretch. But to his credit, he figured it out. But what's troubling is years later, as Robinson integrated the league and more and more players started to be brought in, the Negro Leagues essentially started to flounder and they collapsed. A lot of black businesses went under because a lot of them were supported by this league that essentially fell apart once integration occurred. But when Jackie Robinson was in interviews and they asked him about the Negro League, he often tended to be very dismissive of the league and even dismissive of the players who played in the league, even those some of those who actually helped train him to get him to the place where he could be successful. And as a result of that, many of these players don't have the fond memory or the fond view of Robinson that we now think of. So again, this is not to say that Robinson wasn't a great player. It's obviously, it's a complicated history and a complicated story, but it's not one you often hear. And it's obviously much more interesting to hear it from his black contemporaries rather than hearing it from, mainstream white journalism. But the last thing that I might just mention, which is another interesting tidbit, is that Robinson, therefore, didn't technically integrate baseball. He reintegrated it. Because again, as I mentioned from the start, baseball had always been integrated. From the start, it got segregated in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So Robinson was the first player to reintegrate the league. And that's also a common misconception that people don't know about. It's a really fascinating history. There is more published books out there. Obviously, there's a limited amount of information, but it's been fun to learn. So I thought I'd pass it on to you guys. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day.